So we have to hold the microphone, I guess. Yeah, you just say, let me know what file you want me to go to. Good morning. Let's take our seats. We're going to get started. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for attending the August 2nd North County Estate Planning Council seminar presentation. Thrilled to have you all here and thrilled to see how many of you are here. It's a great time to get together as we come out of COVID and meet face to face and get to know each other a little better than we did before. We have a fantastic presentation today. We're honored to have Phil Sullivan and Jeremy Crickard of Sullivan, McGibbons, Crickard and Associates. They're going to be speaking on the life certainties, death, taxes, and exemption cliffs, planning for and before the next exemption cliff. We'll give a little bit more introduction on that a little bit later. Couple of announcements. David Jacobs and I are going to be planning on a social event later on this summer. So be on the lookout for that later in the afternoon, somewhere here in North County, possibly right outside here, which is where we had our most recent social event in October of 2021. Our next meeting, which is on September 6th, is with Pegene Grayson, JD, and Cap with Whittier Trust. She's a senior vice president, client advisor, and director of philanthropic services. And her presentation is going to cover philanthropic conversations with clients. She's nationally noted, so it'll be a great presentation. So put that on your calendar. A heads up, Jay Robinson Duff, a First American Trust right here, one of our longtime active members. He's invited the council to join their presentations for the Canon webinars. Very top-notch presentations. Unfortunately, I missed the last one, which is at the end of July. But two nationally noted speakers, Clary Red and Turney Berry, were presenting. really they shouldn't be missed. So we'll be looking for those emails as we come forth. October 4th, we have Stacy Aldred of First Republic Bank. She's a national thought leader on family governance, preparing the family for wealth and family business succession planning. And she's going to talk about the broad world of preparing the family for the wealth, education, and so forth. November 1st, December 6th are our next two meetings, and those are, we're still fine tuning the presentations. We may have filled in one of those just this morning. A heads up, go to the website for the council, NCEPC-SD.org. David Jacobs has done a fantastic job of pulling that all together, and log in, certainly update your profile. You can certainly check on future events and other information that he's pulled together for really what's turned into a great website. Our hot topic ladies are somewhat on hiatus at the moment. We've got Katie Swafford and Roberta Robinson. They're always keeping a lookout, so we'll be bringing them back shortly. Pete Tentler is here somewhere, and as I was introducing him to someone earlier, he is certainly Mr. Networker, and he's going to talk about real briefly the council's trifecta process.
Thank you, Bill. Great turnout. It's good to see everybody back again in person. We actually have not enough room. We're bringing in more chairs over here. But this is great. I'm really glad that everyone's here today. I want to talk about the trifecta. This is something that we've been doing now for a couple of years. And I'm going to pass around this glass, put your business card in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to pair you up with other people that might complement your industry. And the trifecta is something you get together for coffee, lunch, breakfast, happy hour, maybe even a hike, and just get to know the other people in your trifecta that may help you with your industry, and get to know each other and help build your network on that as well. So I'm going to pass it around this way. We just keep going all the way around. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. The beauty of those trifectas is we have such a short networking time here today, so it allows you to sit down with, three non-competitors and get to know them more deeply. Much more, what are you working on compared to what college that you went to? So it's a great opportunity to meet people. Certainly want to recognize our board. I'm Bill Super. David Jacobs is here somewhere over here. Website man, Phil Sullivan, one of our speakers, Pete Tentler, Mr. Networker, and Barry Levin for Northern Trust. Just a recognition to our friends at the Jewish Community Foundation. They were instrumental in working with me and getting us set up for the webinars right as COVID hit, and they presented an opportunity that they do webinars all the time. So Ali Ben and Charlene Wallach were instrumental in coming pulling that whole process together. So certainly we thank Charlene and Ali. Ali is here somewhere. There he is. And without any further ado, I want to introduce our speakers, Phil Sullivan and Jeremy Crickard of Sullivan, McGibbons, Crickard and Associates. Phil is a founding partner of Sullivan, McGibbons, Crickard and Associates. His practice is focused on the areas of estate planning, trust and estate administration, and probate. He has extensive experience in planning for individuals and families, including trust formation, transfer tax planning, incapacity planning, interfamily transactions, trust and probate administration, and IRS and estate tax audits. He's a fellow in ACTEC, American College of Trust and Estate Council, and has worked at all the large estate planning firms in San Diego until he founded this firm. He received his master's in law and taxation, LLM from NYU, and is a JD from Villanova University School of Law. Jeremy is another fellow in ACTEC. His practice focuses on counseling families, business owners, and successful individuals in all areas of estate planning. For more than 2 decades, Jeremy has advised his clients on sophisticated family wealth and transfer tax planning, complex trust and probate administration, business succession planning, fiduciary representation, the resolution of federal estate and gift tax audits, and charitable plan giving. Without really any further ado, let me turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everybody for coming today. So we sat down, it was about 2-3 months ago, trying to figure out a topic, and I had some ideas, Jeremy had some ideas, and then Bill had some ideas. And of course, we decided to go with Bill's because he's the boss. And so when we were talking about this presentation, I came to the conclusion it's really every day for us. We meet with clients and we figure out what to do. So we're going to focus on the exemption cliffs and the changes. But I started doing this in the 90s, and I came quickly to learn that it's always fluid. The client relationships are fluid, the wealth is fluid, and the tax law is fluid. So I think the takeaway, there's 2 takeaways I wanted to have at this presentation is, one, you have to be looking at the changes that could happen, not just these changes we see, but last year we had a big scare with the Build Back Better. And quite frankly, I didn't know what we were going to do if they changed the law in December. There wasn't enough time to contact all our clients. So I think it's just part of our planning process that you have to work that in. The second thing is we're going to go from very simple planning to more complex planning. And when you do the complex planning, you have to have a good team. So you have to have good financial planners. You have to have a good CPA. You have to have a good insurance person. And I think that's kind of what we're all about at the North County State Planning Council, is we have all these different facets. So I often find that I come on the stage, I set it up, I set the table like for Thanksgiving, and then I walk out, and then everybody's making a mess, and I come back in later when people die. But the process that has to go throughout that time period is all the supporting staff, not just the professionals, but also people with the client. So that's kind of my takeaways is you have to be fluid, and you have to have a team to support you, because if we set up these things and we don't give them integrity, then the IRS is just going to shut them down. So that's my theme. And I'm the first slide. Brandon, you can shoot that one. Yeah. So our overview is as follows. We're going to talk about the benefits of wealth transfer and why people do it. And then to get everybody's feet on the ground, we're going to go through tax facts, and we're going to talk about the estate tax, the gift tax, the income tax, the generation skipping tax, and the property tax. Because I think, again, with the planning that I've done, it's a big dance between those different taxes and how they all interplay. Sometimes we win on the transfer tax side, and you don't win so much on the income tax side. So we'll give you that overview. And then the threshold questions of, let me put my glasses on for this. How much to transfer, or should you transfer at all? That's a big question. And then if you get over that hurdle, what do you transfer? And there's different types of assets that you can look at in asset classes with respect to the clients. And then how to transfer it, simple gifts, grantor trust, non-grantor trust, sales, loans, things of that nature. And we're going to go through it. Then I'm going to take full authorship of this. I did the 3 client profiles, and you'll notice why my comedy career was cut short in high school from my attempts at humor. If you've read through that part of the presentation. Anyway, we're going to look at those client profiles, and then we're going to apply some of the things we're talking about to them. And then also at the end, we can address anybody's specific questions that they have. But I think that the case studies are kind of illustrative of certain aspects. You have people that are now up in the upper atmosphere of wealth. It's just tremendous wealth, and how you deal with them. You have people that are in that middle piece, and I always say, like, between 50, 70, $80 million. And then you have people like myself who have a lot of college tuitions and life insurance and a 401k and a house. And even those people have some more wealth. When I started doing this at Loose Forward, and there's a bunch of people here that worked with me there, a $5 million estate was huge in 1995, and now it's like poof, everybody's house is worth 2.5 million. So it really has been a change. And the other change I've seen is people are living a lot longer. And so I'm going to give you some ideas on what I'm doing on that level too. So that's the overview, and then we'll have some chance to do questions at the end. We're hoping to go to about 10 to 9 questions, get everybody out. As Jeremy said, when I go to these things, I want to be out the door by 9. And I said, I hear you. So we're going to stick to that timeline. All right, next slide. I'll pass it over to you.
Can you hear me all right? Great. So good morning. So we're going to obviously use our client profiles as a way to sort of illustrate these different techniques. But really at the beginning, we want to talk about why we're even considering wealth transfer. And there's different reasons for different clients, but they usually boil down to a few of these ideas. And oftentimes it's, first, access to financial resources for the next generation. So, maybe there's somebody who they want money to provide for so they can invest, maybe in a business, provide them with access to capital so they can spend or even save for future use. Sometimes we have clients who want to transition a special asset. So, we're worried about business succession planning, transition some ownership of their business to the next generation to run, or maybe there's a family vacation home or some other asset where the client really wants this to be in the hands of somebody else. And those are sometimes some of the focus. But, the bold and italicized item up here is tax savings. And really, oftentimes that's the one that's driving the bus. It's the one that's telling us how to structure things to maximize those benefits. And really that oftentimes is what's bringing the clients into the office is, I want to transfer wealth to my next generation, but I really want to know how to do it in a way that's going to save us overall tax savings. And that often is sometimes the driver. It shouldn't be mistaken for the client's ultimate goal, because there are some clients who their ultimate goal in life is to save tax. But more often than not, it's a blend of saving tax, taking care of the family, and providing for future generations. There are other motivations. Sometimes you have clients who are really charitably inclined. Our clients that we're going to focus on today are really about transferring wealth to their family, just in part because planning for charity is really a whole nother presentation. So we had to limit it a little bit here. And so you'll see our clients are really focused on how do I move wealth to my kids, grandkids, et cetera, in the family. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So tax savings, what are we talking about tax savings? Well, the main one that we're often talking about is gift and estate tax. And so it's helpful to just sort of set the stage and have a little sense of where we are on that. Probably everyone in this room is familiar, but generally speaking, we have an exemption right now that's $10 million indexed for inflation. So in 2022, that means $12 million, a little over $12,060,000. We're also faced with the genius of congressional budgeting, which is we have these constant sunsets so that we don't have to take into account all of the budget impacts of tax cuts. So January 1st, 2026, the taxes exemption is supposed to roll back to $5 million index for inflation. And, if you've heard this before, stop me, but this is something we seem to go through every few years. So we had this in 2012 and 2020, and I'm sure we'll have it again in 2030 or whatever the next election cycle promotes that. And basically, you have this situation where clients are now being faced with, again, a potential cliff. We have a few years to plan for it. And really, what you don't want to do is wait until November of 2025. First and foremost, most of those people in this room will be hiding under a table and not taking phone calls in 2025 if it's November and your clients are coming to you. But really, what I don't like about waiting until the end is these are really big decisions where you're moving lots of wealth and it has lots of implications. And to do that on a rush basis, setting aside what that means for the advisor is really not in the client's best interest. These should really be measured decisions taken over long periods of time where the client has a chance to think about all the details. And so many of the rush planning that's done in these exemption cliffs, the clients are in a few years later and they're fighting the planning that was done for them because either they didn't understand it, it's not accomplishing what they want, And so, as a planner, I really sort of object to this idea that you should plan at the last minute, even if there's an exemption cliff, because it doesn't lead to good results for the clients. But we do have this situation where you're in a use it or lose it situation. And we have the benefit of knowing that, at least in theory, there's no clawback except for a small footnote related to the New York bar, who put in a comment and felt like maybe there was some potential abusive situations. And so unless your client is really, really trying to do some outer edge planning, there's no clawback for the most part. The thing to know about this is, everybody runs out and says, okay, go out and use your exemption. Well, you have to use more than the exemption is going to turn out to be in order for that to work, right? If you go out and make a gift of $1 million or $2 million, you haven't preserved any of the other excess exemption, because when it drops down to $5 million, they're just going to say that you've used up part of that $5 million. So when we talk about use it or lose it, these are really large gifts. $1 million, $2 million isn't going to get you there to use up any excess exemption. And so not everybody is in a position to do that. And so when the client comes to you and says, I want to preserve my excess exemption, if that's really their main motivation, they're going to have to make a really large gift in order to accomplish that. So we're going to talk about some other things they might accomplish along the way, because sometimes those are more important, but sometimes it's that comes in. In addition to using up exemption, we have other tools that we can use to transfer wealth, like the annual exclusion, being able to pay healthcare and tuition expenses directly. And you really shouldn't sleep on those, because you can transfer an awful lot of wealth, as we'll talk about, using those exemptions. But at the end of the day, whatever's left after you've used up your exemption, you're going to pay a tax rate of 40% right now. And so, for some clients, that's going to be a pretty big number at the end of the day. And they want to get out in front of that and try to avoid that savings on a large estate. 40 cents on every dollar over the exemption is really meaningful money. But when we talk about estate tax and gift tax, that's a big part of it. But actually, income tax these days is also a pretty big driver as well. Brandon, if you go to the next slide.
Yeah, and I'll take over. And before I transition to that, there's two other taxes that I wanted to mention. Generation skipping tax, which a lot of people go, what is the generation skipping tax? And it actually is going to be a real thing. It came in 1986, and now actually that skipped generation, and those people are dying. So it's going to be more and more relevant. Reed Moore did a great presentation at Heckerling in 2019, I think it was, before COVID, talking about dealing with the generation skipping tax. Incredible piece that he did. And it is going to become more and more relevant just because of the ages of the skip people. But the bottom line on that tax is they want to tax the first generation, the second generation, the third generation. And when you have a billionaire child, you jump over their head and you save 40%. Well, they figured that part out. So you got to deal with that when you have grandkids. And a lot of our clients are focusing on their grandkids. The other is property taxes and all the changes in the property tax law. Don't get me started on that. I was very disappointed what happened, but it is what it is. And the last thing I wanted to mention on the tax stuff is they are talking about different changes, although the unlimited marital deduction and the unlimited charitable deduction aren't on anybody's legislative table to chop off. So I have clients that are not married, and you'll see one of them there. And the question is, do you get married to avoid the estate tax? And boy, we could have a discussion on that. You probably have to serve drinks and really get into it. So those taxes are there as well. Okay. And again, it's the interplay of all these taxes. And here we have the income tax. So of course, there's two types of income tax. There's an ordinary income, which are earnings, and they are taxed at a higher rate. And then there's capital gains tax, which is a sweetheart rate. So when I got my LLM, I did a presentation on how they use capital gains to get people to invest, and it's a sweetheart rate. I never really bought into that. All I kept saying was, you just pay less tax if you do that. So why wouldn't people want to invest in real estate and stock? And so that's how I looked at it. I was very more analytical than tax policy, but that's the tax policy behind it. So when you look at the federal and state capital gains tax and you add them up, and you look at the state tax, it's kind of close. You can get close to 40% on each of them. And then remember, when you die, the tax comes. When you sell, the income tax comes. So you have to think of the timing of that. So I think these things are just like a big puzzle piece, and you got to figure out the timing of it and what works for clients and talk to them about it. But that is definitely relevant, because I go, oh, it's great. I saved you a bunch of estate taxes, and now you'll have an income tax problem down the road. So that's important to look at the differences there. Back when I started, it was 55% was the estate tax and the capital gains was a lot lower. So the spread was different. Now the spread's pretty tight. All right. The other thing is, for whatever reason, they decided to choose different things for basis. So when you gift assets, you transfer basis. And when you die with assets, you get a step up in basis. So when people go, I want to transfer this or I want to transfer that, you have to get the factual information. You have to find out. That's why having the CPA involved is really critical, because they will have their fingers on that and they can tell you what the basis is. And then you can make measured decisions on it, whether you're giving to a grantor trust or non-grantor trust, and you can do swap powers. We'll get into that, but that is a relevant factor looking at what the basis in the asset is. Okay, and then that step up is just, it's incredible. And they were thinking about getting rid of that. I was like, no, that is just an awful idea. But I think when they said that Build Back Better, they just chucked everything up against the wall and they were going to cut stuff back. But that one I thought was going to be tragic. And I mean, Joe Manchin put that version of the bill to sleep, and it made our fall better. Jeremy came in and said, I think it's dead. I'm going home for the day because I've been here 24/7. And I went into Jennifer's office and I said, Jeremy thinks it's dead. It's got to be dead. We can all go home for the day. And I actually had a nice Thanksgiving and a December that I could spend some time. But it is here now. And then incredibly, in community property states, you get the double step up in basis, which is awesome, unless you're an estate planning attorney who has clients that have separate property and community property. And I'm not sure what that property is. And so you sit down with them and all the ethics involved in that and talking to them. And now I say, yeah, if you're going to transmute, you got to get two attorneys. You need an attorney and you need an attorney. And they're like, wait, two more attorneys and you? And I go, yeah. And they're like, I don't want to pay you, let alone two more attorneys. So then you say, well, I advise you to do it. And I'm going to talk about slats later, but that double step up is an incredible benefit. And it really sets up ethical issues, because I have clients that are elderly. They have low basis assets. They got these places in the ranch that they bought for a couple $1 million, and now they're $15 million. And my partner Robert and I are working on this one, and I'm looking at them going, we need one of you to die so we can get the full double step up in basis. Then we can figure out doing gifting. And that's a horrible thing to say to clients, but I'm really honest with them. And I go, I'm banning about your mortality, but this is the way it is, and how it works. So we are planning ahead, but a lot of it, we're just sitting tight to see what happens in November, see what happens in 2024, because if miracle, they did make this law permanent, it would make things a lot better. But of course, I always say Congress is good at doing one thing, nothing. So you assume that it's going to sunset, but that's it. So a lot of this stuff, I'm trying to get people to plan. I say, we got a ton of runway, but next thing you know, it'll be 2024, 2025, and we'll be scrambling. And then, differences in the state income tax. Yeah, people come in and say, I want to save taxes. And I go, okay, move out of California. I grew up in New York, New Jersey. I'm sorry to everybody that grew there. I don't want to be in New York and New Jersey. I want to live in San Diego, California. It is awesome here. People go, I'm traveling here and there. I'm on vacation every weekend because I love it here. But the state income tax is horrible. So you have to balance those things out as well. And when people go, no, I think I want to stay here, I'm like, yeah, we have to deal with that. But remember, you can get out of California, but you got to divest yourself of California as well. So there's two levels to it. And you can't play that game. Well, I'm just going to be here 6 months, and you play the fugitive. And I just think that's a horrible way to exist. So either get out or stay. And if you're going to stay, yeah, then start voting, and maybe we can get the state income taxes down. Okay. And then specialty assets. Yeah. Jenny Bratt did a great presentation on QSBS, and Jeremy's going to talk a little bit more about that. I have limited experience in that. I have a couple matters with it, and we'll talk about non-grantor trust. But the point of this slide is the income taxes are relevant. Income taxes are all the time, and we are the death guys. So it's death and gifts, but the income tax is every single day. Oh, and I'm gonna keep going. Next slide, please. All right. Yeah. So then the question becomes, should you make a gift? And I sit down with the clients, and I always say to clients that there are just a couple factors. One is you got to plan on living to probably 100 now. Yeah, 100. And whether you're still functioning, that's a whole nother question, but you're going to be alive to 100. So plan on that. 2, the markets are going to go up. The markets are going to go down. We've seen that in real time with wars and things like that. So you got to make sure you have enough wealth to live on and provide yourself with in-home care, which is really expensive. I went through it with my parents, and the out-of-pocket costs are really, really extreme. So you have to make sure you protect yourself. And then I told them there's only one sure thing. There's no such thing as a sure thing. Here's a sure thing. Healthcare is going to be more expensive. So you got to make sure you're planning for healthcare, because the worst thing you want to do with a client is knock on your son or daughter's door and say, I'm out of money. Can I live in your back porch? And they're going to say, no, I don't really want you to live in my back porch. So you got to plan for yourself. So that's the first thing. You protect the clients and you make sure. So we sit down with the financial planners and we do those Monte Carlo simulations. And we say, can you afford it? What do you have? And then you'll see from my case studies, I mean, the people that are in the hundreds of millions, it's a no-brainer, and they should have done their planning a couple of years ago. And then the people that are below 20 million, they just probably will sit tight. But those people in the middle, which are a lot of our clients, it's a tough call. And the question is that the dollars are pretty dear, because if I have 50 million and I lose 10 million, that's a huge part of my estate. If I have 700 million and I lose 20 million, who cares? And that's kind of the clients we have now, that they have the spectrum range. So I like working on those clients in the middle, because I feel like that's the true value that I can give my client. I really save them dollars. The people in the upper atmosphere, they got to work in charitable planning. It just has to happen, or they're going to pay 40%. That's the bottom line. And then the people that are below that, we have some ideas for them, but you don't really have to worry about the exemptions at this point, because they'll probably stay at the worst case scenario, 6 million, or 12 million a couple. So that's just do they have financial resources? Okay, and I'm a big letter B here, the transaction cost. To me, I spend a ton of time talking about that, because we set this stuff up and I tell them it's annually you have to do things. So my war story, when we were talking about war stories, is when it was like 1996, I set up an LLC late in the year. We did giftings. We transferred out. I think Patty was working with me on this one, and we got it out and the client paid. The guy had a ton of money. And then he called me up in December or January and he said, oh, I got a bill for the LLC to pay the fee. And I go, yeah. And he goes, yeah, I already paid that. And I was like, oh, then you're good. That's okay. And he goes, okay. Calls me back about 2 weeks later. And he goes, I got another bill. And I go, for the LLC? And he goes, yeah. I go, for what year? And he goes, well, this year. And I go, oh, you said you paid it? And he goes, no, that was last year. I go, yeah, it's an annual fee. You got to pay it every year. And he goes, every year I have to pay that $800? And I'm like, look at my letter. It says annual. Now, this person had more money than I'll ever have in a million lifetimes. And I'm going, you don't understand what annual fee is? And I was like, wait, you really have to tell these people what it is. And they're very sophisticated. So I go through pains to say, okay, this means every year you have to pay this fee. Oh, and then you're going to have to pay your CPA. Well, they're just working me on that. I go, no, they're earning a living and they're doing a good job, but you got to factor that in. So I really talk about the financial commitment, and I say what the appraisal fees are, what the attorney's fees, because everybody knows people are fee sensitive. And I go, I usually walk off the stage and you have all these people, because if you don't do the compliance, you might as well just not do the transaction. And so with ILITs, you got to check your insurance policies, because it's an asset. You just don't buy it and let it sit there. You have to think about these things. So I go through this and I say, are you ready to do this? Do you want to make this commitment? And once they are on board, and then you have other ones that are just serial LLC and trust stuff. But we'll have clients, I think, have 20, 30, 40 trusts, on a giant spreadsheet. And so there is a lot of compliance, and the clients go, why can't you make it simple? Just be one giant trust. And I go, because that's what I do for a living. And all the lawyers in Congress are setting me up for the rest of my life. And I say, no, because this is the way it is, and life's complicated. So that transaction cost, I spend a lot of time in and make sure people understand before we take the job. Like the revocable living trust, I'm like, yeah, it's easy, you can change it, but this is a much more of a commitment. Okay, and then again, there's our adverse tax consequences. Are you wasting exemption if you use an asset that goes down in value? The property taxes, oh my gosh, that is a huge issue now. And you say, oh, if I don't transfer it, then I won't have a reassessment. Yeah, that's right. But then like I don't get the property taxes. That whole part was crazy. People wanted to give away their houses, and I'm rolling my eyes going, oh, my son is such a nice boy and he'll take care of me. I go, what happens if he dies? Yeah, I never thought of that. Oh, and I don't like his wife. Yeah. Yeah. And now you're living in her house. Yeah. Why don't you hold on to your house and you'll get the step up when you die, assuming that they don't change that. So all those issues that go into play. And again, if you're transferring assets, transfer basis, die step up in basis. So those are the some of the potential adverse consequences. But now let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I'll add one other one that clients often come to you and say is, well, if I give this person $5 or $10 million, what's it going to do to them? How are they going to change their lifestyle? Right. And so to me, that's also a really big factor in terms of, you know, a potential adverse consequence of wealth transfer. What's it going to do to the recipient? We can modify that, or we can mitigate that on some level by how we gift and trust or otherwise. But that's also a big impact in terms of what clients are worried about. But so, you know, with these sort of basic concepts in mind, you know, we kind of have one immediate threshold question that we always ask is this client interested in wealth transfer? So big picture, do they have a recipient that they want to benefit now, right? Because that's not every client. I can sit down and look at a lot of clients and have them come to me and say, okay, what should I be doing? We can talk about the wealth planning, but oftentimes they may not have somebody they want to benefit right now. And then are they willing to give up a financial benefit that they have to bestow upon this person? And that's not always the case. It's interesting, we talk about war stories, but we have lots of clients who come in and they have, you know, 50, 100, 150 million dollars, but maybe they have no kids, no grandkids, and they're going to leave everything to charity. It's just not an estate tax issue for them. There's no estate tax benefit for them to transfer. There might be an income tax benefit, so they might get some income tax planning, but it's really not a wealth transfer issue in terms of the estate tax. And I can think about this one case that we had where the client was 90 something years old. He was fairly affluent and had spent most of his life living in a nice house in La Jolla Shores and had plenty of money in the bank. And he was the remainder beneficiary of this trust that was set up way back in 1910 by a family member. And they had put original issue GE stock in this trust. And the rule against perpetuities of all things was going to cause this trust to terminate and distribute to different family members. And so he was potentially going to get a distribution. It was a handwritten will by a grandmother, a great grandmother, actually. And so there were some ambiguities, although I have to say for a handwritten will by someone in 1910, there's less ambiguities in her drafting than I've seen in maybe some of our drafting. So she did a really good job, but they were going to have this dispute over the who was going to inherit. And there were all these different family members who came out of the woodwork saying, oh, I'd like some. And everybody wanted some. And so we said to the client, hey, you're 95. You have this remainder interest. We think you're going to come out pretty well in this case, but right now it's really uncertain what you're going to get. And we don't know when it's going to happen because they're all litigating over it. We could have you gift your interest, whatever it is, to your 3 kids. And it's going to, the discount that the appraiser had come up with was huge. And so it's going to knock off, you know, tens of millions of dollars of estate tax. And we had this great plan and we were so excited about it. And we came to him, we said, here it is. This is great. All you have to do is assign it, file a gift tax return. We'll sit here and wait for the thing. And he looked at us and he said, they can wait. Said, I'm 95. I haven't gotten my wealth. My kids can wait. And that was it. He had no interest in transitioning wealth, no matter how good of a plan we come up with. So, you know, this slide is on here just to remember that at the end of the day, not every client wants to gift, right? No matter how great the plan is or how mathematically we can show them how much tax we'll save, sometimes the client just doesn't want to do it. And that's actually perfectly okay. Client gets to decide what they want to chase. And so don't ever forget that it's the client who's going to dictate this. But once we get over that threshold, if we have a client who wants to gift, then we kind of use 3 basic questions to try to triangulate on what might be the best way for us to gift. And we kind of run through those, and they're interrelated, but they basically help us get to the position of what planning might work well for this client.
Yeah, and those questions are on this slide here. What can a client afford to transfer? So with that one, I always tell people, pull out your Shakespeare, pull out King Lear. Remember what happened to old poor King Lear? I remember I read that in high school and I was like, what was it? What's this all about? As I do estate planning, I go, ooh, you don't want to end up like King Lear in the forest with all your daughters taking your property. And I remember somebody got their eyes gouged out. I don't think King Lear got his eyes gouged out. Somebody did. I just remember that from King Lear. So should you give your property away? I don't know. And then again, I'm a true planner. They go, oh, I'm going to give it to my kids and they're going to take care of me. And I'm like, yeah, you're assuming your kids are not going to, not predecease you. Think about that too. Oh, yeah, I never thought about that. So really go through with them. And again, can they afford it? Working with the financial planners to do the worst case scenarios with the markets crashing and new wars and things of that nature, and make sure that they can do it. And then what are they willing to transfer? So I always think there's different types of clients. I always said there's clients with kids, there's clients with pets. And then in this situation, there's different clients. There's tax-driven clients, and I do not want to pay a transfer tax. Let's zero it out. And I actually think they're a lot simpler to work with because we only have so much bandwidth. And then we are working in a charity. And again, we're not talking about charities here, but the charitable deduction is just, it's fantastic. And it's great tax policy. Instead of it going to the US government, you don't have to, you can work at the charity. So it is a voluntary tax, the estate tax. And that's why you'll see the billionaires trying to sign people up to say, transfer it over. And the hope is the charity helps the little guy and then the government doesn't have to do it. So there is still some sort of tax policy left in, but there are those clients that go, I do not want to pay a state and gift tax, and we work with them. And again, there's trade-offs with the income tax and the real property tax and such. So there's that. Then there's clients that are just completely charitable driven. They don't have any children and they don't even use their exemptions. And I like working with those clients as well. And they don't have to necessarily make the transfers now, but I think they want to prime the pump and they want to see how it's going. And I always say there's like options with your charitable planning. You can work with the charities and work up a gift agreement and work with them hand in glove. We've done a lot of that with a lot of the charities in town. There's also donor advised funds. I like donor advised funds. I think they really work well. I mean, people call them the poor man's foundation, but I think they're fantastic. You don't have to do any of the compliance. You don't have to hire the attorney to do it. And they work really well. And it feels like you're running a foundation. And then there's the private foundation. If you're going to do a private foundation, you're going to put in big dollars in that. So back when I started with Luce, it was about, oh, you want to put 2 million. Then it was 5 million. Now I'm thinking it's like 10 million. I don't know. How much do you tell people to put in?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I try to get people to do a donor advised fund first, whatever the number is, just so that they get used to it and plan. But yeah, I would say certainly more than 5 and probably closer to 10 just to live with that. But it also, this is the complexity question too, right? As a client, is this a client who lives with complexity and is okay with the idea that they're going to run this? Or is this a client that, is going to ask about the annual fee every year? And it's okay. It's okay to be in either camp, but you want to pick the right tool for the right client.
Yeah. And so then the last person is they want to get the wealth to their children or their grandchildren. And then I ask them to kind of reverse engineer it. How much do you want the child to get? Because with the valuation, you call them valuation discounts, I call it fair market value. With the fair market values that we can get, we can a lot of times leverage. And then you see some of these things that we've done just catapult. So we did a defective grantor trust in, I think it was 1996. And I think the client bought, and Pat, you probably know better than me, bought like 20 single family residences for, I don't know, a couple $100,000, and they all just rocketed through. I mean, it's just a tremendous value. It was an incredible investment. And then he finally he's passed away, but he finally turned off the grantor trust. So he was tired of paying the income tax on it. And each of these kids are going to get a tremendous amount of money. So that's the concern with some of these younger kids. And will they become trust fund babies? And how do we deal with that? Then with that type of planning, we do look to directed trusts in other jurisdictions, because that's a good way to kind of hedge that and protect children. So some of the clients set what they want the child to get, and they kind of earmark that, and we do the gifting to achieve that goal, and then they have the charitable piece sweeping over. Next slide, Brandon.
So after we've confronted the magnitude question, we kind of look to see what assets the client has. This is going to be our clay, is what I like to call it. But what do we have to work with in order to transfer assets? And usually what I'm trying to do first is try to figure out what's off limits. So what does the client need to retain? And we've talked a little bit about they need to retain enough to keep the wealth level and the cash flow that they need. But you have to be careful. Sometimes you can come up with a great idea to transfer an asset, but that's the asset that they're living the cash flow off of. So you need to kind of be sensitive to that. We're also looking at special assets. So, usually we're trying to stay away from personal use assets if we can. So, the house that they're in, the things that they're going to use, those don't make great gifting items because we're worried they're going to have a retained interest and it's going to basically unwind our planning, that the IRS is going to say, nice try, you didn't actually transfer anything. And so we're worried about that. We're worried about other things like maybe the client needs to keep a certain percentage of the business to keep control. Maybe they have a requirement, within the shareholders agreement or with a lender that they have to keep a certain ownership interest. So you have to be sensitive to those. Sometimes there are special business requirements. So, over the years, I've run into things like, if you own auto dealerships, you have to maintain a certain ownership percentage of the auto dealership. If you own a professional sports franchise, you have to keep a certain level of ownership. Different areas of the world have these different requirements that maybe aren't tax driven, but they are a reality that you have to plan around. And then there are places where there actually are real transfer restrictions, meaning your client can't unilaterally transfer the asset. So they need to go out and get, their co-business owner's permission, or they need to get some type of approval or from a lender, for example. And so you want to watch out for those and sort of push those sort of what is off limits assets to the side and see what you have left to plan with. And then there we're really looking at different factors to see what might make the best assets to transfer. And we're looking at things like the basis in an asset. Depending on the way in which we're transferring something, we might prefer to have high basis assets to transfer rather than low if we have that choice, just because we don't get the extra basis step up if we transfer it. We might lose that. And you got to look out for things like, I came across one where, when I was in law school and I took a tax class, there was no such thing as negative basis, right? That doesn't actually technically exist. But practically, there are certain types of assets where your basis can actually not be a negative number, but the tax effect of it is essentially like that. So you see this sometimes in real estate. And so you can actually, by gifting and losing that basis step up, you can actually do more harm than good, right? So you really need to pay attention to this basis issue. We're looking for growth assets. So a startup or a biotech or something like that, that's really going to jump off the page over time. Those are great assets to transfer. As Phil talked about, we want to pay attention to the property tax considerations. Sometimes if we can fractionalize, that's a great asset to gift. So if the client owns 100% of something, if we can gift a small piece, what's great about that is the gift might have some level of adjusted fair market value. I'll call it discounting, where you get a benefit of the gift, but you also get that same benefit for what you retain, right? So what I like to say to the client is, look, by transferring 10%, that 10% is worth less, but maybe your 90% that you're going to keep is also worth less. So just by transferring a small piece, we've accomplished two things. We want to look for things that have a special tax status. So we'll talk a little bit when we look at the clients about QSBS. Sometimes we're worried about being able to qualify for 6166, which is the ability to pay estate tax in installments. So we want to make sure we don't do any harm there if that's important to the client. Cash flow we're looking at. So don't give up something the client needs the cash flow from, but also if you're going to give something, pay attention to what the expenses are for that asset. Is the recipient going to be able to pay those expenses out of their cash flow, or do you have to come up with some other way in which to be able to pay for the fact that they're going to own that asset? Valuation considerations are another one. And big picture, honestly, what I'm looking for when I look at these different types of assets is I'm looking for something more than just we're going to transfer this asset and hope it does well. I'm looking for some place where we have an extra enhancement because of the fact that you're giving up the basis step up. You need to do better than just transferring the asset, because the difference between the estate tax rate and the capital gains rate is so close that you could actually do harm. And so I'm looking for places where I can get more than just transferring that asset. And so fractionalizing ownership is an answer, a place where I have an asset that's really going to pop in growth, where we are going to use up the expiring exemption. But again, as we've talked about, that has to be a really big number we're transferring to use that extra exemption, or where there's some level of income tax benefits on top of it. So, we're going to put the asset in a trust that's outside of California and defer California income tax, or we're going to have grantor trust status so that the client gets to pay the tax liability as an additional gift. we're going to talk about some of those, but really what I like to say is I'm looking for an enhanced gift. I'm not looking for just a straight gift because the math is too close on a straight gift. There's a presenter, Paul Lee, who goes around and has this great presentation about how basically you should not gift and use exemption. And again, that's setting aside places when we have cliffs because of the fact that the differential is so close. You should try to transfer wealth without using up your exemption so you get the basis step up. And he takes an extreme view, but the point is well taken. You have to be really careful. You can actually do a lot more harm than good by gifting if you're not paying attention to that. So once we've figured out what our clay is, and Brandon, if you go to the next slide, we're starting to look at our toolbox to see what choices we have in order to transfer wealth.
Yeah, and before I just get into that slide, two things. One, you mentioned the transfer restrictions, and really loans and the lenders have to be involved in this. And you say to them, we're making a transfer of this, and how will that affect your loans? So I tell clients before you do any type of transfers or we talk about it, you talk to your lenders because you can, all the trust stuff works and it actually is problematic to the banks. And so you want to make sure they're on board because you say, well, it's great. We saved you some death taxes probably when you died, but we screwed up your business now because you can't get a loan. That's not what you want to do. The other thing, my story with negative basis is I had a client that had a company and they basically had negative basis, and I worked up this whole big plan and then rolled it out to the client, and we brought the CPA in the second call and he went, there's negative basis here. And I went, oh, oops. No, you don't want to do that transfer anymore. And he was kind of like, well, you were promoting it. And I go, yeah, I didn't check the basis. Yeah. So you want to definitely check the basis before you do it. And you're making money today. You have a business today. You don't want to do it. So enhancing it, also not screwing up people's lives for the death. And people go, well, we'll pay a tax when I die. And I go, yeah, there was a year when no one paid tax in 2010. So it's possible that we don't have an estate tax, but probably not probable, but possible. Okay, so the options for transferring wealth, I'm just going to kind of fly by these and then we're going to get into them deeper. Do you gift or do you loan or do you do both? With the low interest rates, loans are really attractive. That's a way to do it. They have to be just structured properly so that it's not deemed to be a gift. Do you just give it outright or do you put it in trust? And the pros and cons to that. If you put it in an irrevocable trust, is it a grantor trust? Is it a non-grantor trust? Is it a California trust? Is it a non-California trust? And we'll go through all the pros and cons of that. Do you want to keep a retained interest? And there's ways we can do that with a qualified personal resident trust, with grantor retained annuity trust. And we'll talk about slats and also sales and loans and such. And again, over and over, to me, the complexity of these situations and how involved are we getting in this transaction, make sure they're on board to do that. And then, remember the client's goals. What are your goals? So I often say to them, is your goal to not pay tax? Is your goal to get the kids a certain amount of money? And we work with them and figure out what their plan is, because a lot of times I'll get these plans with 20 LLCs, 10 trusts, and they're like, I don't know why we did this. And then I go, I fault the planner that they didn't explain it to them. So I'm very measured when I go with people regarding any of this planning, because I don't want them to say, you didn't tell me. I go, yeah, you have buyer's remorse. No, I explained it to you. So you can't say you didn't know what you were getting into. You've changed your mind because you're weary of the fees, and we can try to rewind it, or they change the laws and now you don't need the valuation, favorable valuation adjustments on your assets, and we want to change it, but I make sure that they go in eyes wide open. All right, so here's my attempt at humor. These are the three client profiles. Yeah, Brandon, if you go to the next one. So these are the averages, and they're actually pretty good averages with this net worth. But believe it or not, everybody, at least in Southern California, has a house that's worth $2 million something now. So Jane and John average. They're not married, but they've been together for 12 years. So I have a bunch of clients like that, and that's a fun conversation to have. And you say, have you, let me tell you about the marital deduction, and they go, yeah, well, she doesn't want to get married, and I'm like, wow. And then I try to get them a counselor. They have 3 children. Their children just average, below average, and above average. That's why I'm not in comedy. And their net worth, they have a house with $1 million. Now it's 2 million. They have an IRA. They have a stock portfolio, and they have no life insurance. So I've never gone just high net worth or low net worth. I like working with all types of clients. So I have a lot of clients in that range. I get young clients that come in with lots of income and they say, I need an estate plan. I'm like, no, you need an estate. So you go buy yourself some life insurance and then come back to me, and then but we'll talk about that later. Okay, and the next one is the Awesomes. They've been married 35 years and they're awesome. They're 63 and 65. The Awesomes have 2 children, totally, and freaking, and they have their rescue dog, so awesome, and his human ages too. They're a $45 million estate with a San Diego home, a mammoth condo, a stock in a biotech company, an IRA, a large IRA, stock portfolios, LLC interests, and they have a small second to die life insurance policy. So I enjoy working with these clients, and there's a lot of my clients are in this sector because, again, depending upon when they die in the planning and the timing of the planning, we can really reduce the tax. And I think that the dollar they pay me is helpful because I can save them money relative to the size of the estate. So I enjoy these the most. I feel like this is where they get the best bang for a buck when they hire us. But they are much more difficult to decide what to do. Should you gift? Should you not gift? And as Jeremy said, if you're going to take advantage of that exemption, you got to give away a lot of money. But we'll talk about some options on that. Not doing 20, maybe doing just 10. And how we could set that up. All right. And my last one are the Uber people. So I took, I blended the Mates family. Now this is a blended family. So that's interesting too. Each has a spouse from a prior marriage. Elon's daughter, X2 $5 is 3. Yeah, right. And Melinda's son, Post. You didn't get that, Postmates. That was my son's subtle contribution to this. He was helping me write these up, but their net worth is 350 million or 450 million, whatever, just in super duper wealth. And, they have all this real estate, stock investments, and huge IRA, S corps, art collection, and second to die life insurance. And I find these a lot easier to deal with. And I'll tell you kind of my formula for them once we get through it. So let's shoot into now we got all our case studies, and now we have our clay, we have our thing. People want to gift. How do we do it?
So we'll come back to our exciting clients in a minute, but we'll talk about a couple of transfers, and then we're going to go back and look through our clients and see what might make sense for them. But the first slide here is for outright gifts. And so, outright gifts have their place in estate planning. I mean, they're, as this kind of the bullet points talk about, they're simple, expedient, low cost. Oftentimes they give you a chance to fractionalize ownership, even with an outright gift. So a small percentage interest in a family business or otherwise, even if the client doesn't want to go through the trouble of setting up trust, can really provide a lot of benefit to get that fractionalization. And I find they're oftentimes tools for problem solving. So clients loan money to their child's not making payments on the loan. Maybe we just turn that into a gift and clean that up. So yeah, it's not the most efficient use of exemption, but I don't love the client being out there having a loan that's not really functioning like a loan. So maybe it's a good way to clean things up. And I think you shouldn't sleep on how effective these simple transfers can actually be. I had a client who had 4 or 5 kids. The kids were married. There were 10 grandkids. They were just doing annual exclusion gifting, and they were doing it not of cash, but of interest in a business, both stock and in a partnership. And they're transferring on an annual basis of more than $200,000 discounted. So maybe $300,000 a year. And they did that for 15 or 20 years. And yeah, it wasn't the most exciting plan in the world, but it was super effective. And we pushed out a ton of wealth in that family, and to the point where they didn't end up owing much, if any, estate tax at the back end. So just based on that. The other one I like here sometimes is to front load the 529 plans. So people want to pay for education for grandkids. You can do 5 years worth of annual exclusion. So, for a couple, that's $160,000 you can put aside now for a grandchild. You do have to be a little bit careful about overfunding 529 plans. But since I have a senior in high school and I've been looking at tuition, I think maybe $160,000 might not be enough when you factor it all in. And so in the long run, that can be really useful. And a lot of clients are focused on education for their families. And so that's an easy one. But there are limitations on outright gifts, and they're up there. So there's no creditor or spousal protection. There's no future estate tax protection. So when we gift to a trust, we can apply both gift and GST exemption and protect things over the long run. And you're not protecting the assets from the control or decision making of the recipient, which sometimes is a big deal. I've had a bunch of clients come to me and say, hey, we set up these cut my accounts. They were great. It's like $250,000 in here. My kid's turning 18 and I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen. And I said, well, that money's kind of already out the door. It's no longer yours once they turn 18. They get access to it. And so you try to back into things like, well, maybe you could invest that money in a family partnership that kind of binds the 18-year-old, or maybe you talk them into, they'll put their own money in an irrevocable trust, but you're already chasing a horse that's out of the barn, right? And so that's not necessarily the best outcome. But it's not always about gifts. Sometimes the more effective planning is actually about loans or sales or other transfers. Change the slide.
Yeah, and before you hit those, it was funny. Jeremy and I split up the slides, and I was writing down things on his slides, and he mentioned it too, that I was going to mention annual exclusion gifts of 529s. If you implement a lifetime annual exclusion plan and actually have an insurance piece on it, it can really be a huge benefit, and it's simple. And it works. And then 529s are just fantastic. I started practicing before Section 529 was around, so we did a lot of education trusts, the compliance on those, and then the payment of the income tax, and they're just a drag. So the 529s, there are some limitations on what you can use them for in investments, but I think they're fabulous. And there's one thing I always raise with my clients immediately. If you do the outright gifting, though, not to an irrevocable trust, you want to make sure all the kids have revocable trust. So most of my clients, when their kids turn 18, we do a healthcare power and a power of attorney. And then once they have transfers, and there's a lot of kids that have these up my accounts or cut my accounts, and we make sure that they have a trust in place. And then if they decide to get married, I tell them they have to get a prenup. So, all right. So, I know, so wonderful. It's like, you want to get married, you got to get a prenup. And we don't do prenups anymore. You don't do prenups.
Nope.
Nope.
Family law lawyers are great at that.
Yeah. Jen and I jumped off that train about 15 years ago. I was like, we're done. We're not doing prenups anymore. So we just refer out for that. We are an estate tax boutique. Okay. Loans versus assets and sales. So back when the credit was 600,000 and you didn't have a lot of other things to do, we were doing a lot of grantor trusts. We were doing a lot of sales, or just doing straight up sales. And again, you have potential triggering in the gain. So the loans were, I think, a great thing when the interest rates are low. The interest rates are going up now. And Jeremy's correct. You got to have a certain rate. You got to have the AFR, and you got to do it. So you got to work with the CPA and make sure they're making the payments or making the interest payments, because if not, they're going to call BS on that. We had one estate where the mom made a loan to her son, and it was like I didn't think he had the wherewithal to get the loan, let alone pay the loan. And of course he didn't, and he defaulted, and she died. And so when we were doing the state tax return, we reported the loans as zero. I was convinced that the IRS was going to come back and say that they were gifts at the time, and you just disguised them as loans. And I actually flew out to Cleveland twice to tell the beneficiaries we're going to go through the audit, and lo and behold, didn't get audited. So they work, and you just need to make an effort to make sure you're complying with it. And then limitations are pretty much the same as if German went through: no credit protection or GST. So it's simple and it works, but some people get nervous about the simplicity of it.
Yeah, I find loans are a great way. So if the client says, look, I'm going to transfer a little bit, but not a lot. Especially when interest rates are really low, we'd say, okay, make a gift to a grantor trust, and then you want to keep a certain amount of capital, loan a bunch of money at a low interest rate, maybe a really long loan, right? And you say, okay, give the trust $5 or $10 million at a 1 or 2% interest rate was what it was. Now you're closer to 3%, but even at 3%, you'd say, okay, over a long period of time, most of the investment advisors, if you had 20 or 30 years, are going to feel comfortable they can beat 1 or 2 or 3%. You've given that capital to your child. They have the use of it, all that growth. And when you need to be paid back, they can always prepay the loan. And so it gives you a financial resource, but you've really shifted a lot of wealth. And yeah, you didn't use up your exemption, but in the long run, that's transitioning a lot of wealth to the next generation. So I like loans for that as well. So, we've talked about the simple ones. The next level up is actually using trusts, right? And that's really mostly what we do. We're transferring things to irrevocable trusts. The first slide here is non-grantor trusts. Again, any irrevocable trust, you can usually get some level of creditor protection and spousal protection, which is a big focus of our clients these days. They're worried about that boyfriend or girlfriend who's going to get access to those family assets and do terrible things. Sometimes, people get divorced in California, I've heard. It happens on occasion. And so when that happens, not everybody is happy. And so sometimes their ability to get ownership interest in a family business or a family asset causes friction in the family. You've got to deal with that less than excited or less than cooperative ex-spouse. And so that's a big deal. But the one that I like is also being able to shelter these assets from future estate tax at the next generation, right? So you're transferring it to your child, you're putting it in a vehicle that's going to be sheltered from tax even when they pass away. That long-term sort of building of wealth is really powerful. You do also get to control how those assets are accessed when you have a trust. So, no worrying about coming at age 18 or 25 and the child having control of those if you don't want that. And it does give you the ability to take advantage of, if you use a non-grantor trust, to take advantage of the tax laws of another state. So, I see sometimes clients want to move assets to Nevada, Delaware, and take advantage of that low income tax rate. You got to watch out for our throwback tax in California. So, oftentimes I tell clients that that's really more of a tax deferral until you make a distribution. And when you make the distribution, you're going to get tagged with California if those beneficiaries are still in California. But at worst case, it's still tax deferral, and that can be really powerful. And if your beneficiary is no longer in California and they live outside of California a while before there's a distribution, maybe you do avoid the California taxation. But those are pretty strong benefits. We'll come back to non-grantor trusts for other special assets too, but the one that I really like is the next slide, which is grantor trusts, which Phil's going to talk about.
Yeah. And so for the non-grantor trusts, what kind of most amazing thing is when you look at the brackets, when they publish the brackets and you see when you hit the top bracket. So individuals and couples and head of household, it's usually you hit the 37% bracket over $500,000 as income. There's different rates for different classifications. In the non-grantor trust, you hit 37%, and I think I got this right, at $13,450. And so you go, wow, you're going to be paying 37%. And people go, how is that possible? And I go, yeah. So a lot of people don't understand that. So when you say we're doing the non-grantor trust, if you trap it inside the trust, then you're paying that rate. If you want to K1 it out to the beneficiary, then they have to get the income and they'll pay at a lower rate. So that is a big consideration when you're doing non-grantor trusts.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the non-grantor trusts have a little bit of a bullseye on them right now. I mean, some of the tax proposals that were being kicked around were tagging on extra percentages to the income on those. So right now, they look like they're an area of sort of a target to raise additional tax. So it's bad enough now. And so you might end up with some additional, 3-5% taxes on those non-grantor trusts. And so I do think that's a really important criterion, which is, again, why I really like grantor trusts.
Yeah, and same here. So grantor trusts, I did a presentation with Mark Morris. He did the second half of it. I wasn't there for that part, but we talked about in full grantor trusts and the pros and cons of those and the trigger pieces. But you can look back at that one if you want a more in-depth. But the bottom line with the grantor trust is the grantor is paying the income tax. It is literally the gift that keeps on giving. So you make the transfers into the trust. Any of the income that's in there can stay in the trust, and the grantor pays it, and it's a free gift. So it really works well. It's an incredible leverage. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why they were trying to shoot it down in the Build Back Better bill. A lot of people saw that legislation. They didn't even know what grantor trusts were. And of course, we were freaking out because I have tons of grantor trusts, and we were trying to figure, are they going to grandfather them in? Are they going to switch them out later on? But they're really neat vehicles, and it's a great way to kind of drain an estate by having the grantor pay the income taxes, which the income tax has to be paid. And by them paying the income tax, it's a free gift to the trust.
Yeah, actually, sometimes it works so well that clients come back and say, well, do I still have to keep paying the tax for my child or on this trust? And you say, I always say to them, well, look, it's a great benefit. It's wonderful. you're shifting wealth, but eventually at some point they just get tired of paying someone else's taxes. And so you do sometimes turn that off eventually, but that's the great thing. You can turn it off in the future as well. But maybe we should try to have some fun here and go back and look at some of our clients and look at the different
Can we go back
techniques.
to that first case scenario?
So I think it's slide 11. And
Yeah, the average.
sorry for the right side of the room here, but we're going to kind of toggle back and look at our clients. So we're going to start with the average family and just talk a little bit about how some of these techniques might apply for them.
Yeah, so I look at them and I that type of client, I sit down with them and I say, hey, you're doing a great job and you're building your wealth. And what about the marital deduction? And I do explain how that works. And I tell them from the foot, this does not mean you should get married for tax reasons, but it's relevant. And I had a variety of clients that had long-term relationships and they were not married. So I tell them, okay, I'm just telling you the facts and here it is. And it's one of those things that if you're, terminal and you get married and you can get the marital deduction, it's a big deal. If you don't tell them and they die, then I think there's a malpractice action. We had one of those with a lottery benefit and it was bad. It was really bad news. I think the client did sue the other attorney and got some money, but if they were married, it would have been avoided. So on this scenario, I purposely did not make them marry, and I had that conversation. And it's like sticking your head in the lion's mouth. Sometimes it goes out well, and sometimes I literally have one right now, and they keep saying, "Well, we thought about it, but we just never went down to the JOP." And I'm like, oh, okay, well, you decide what you want to do, but here, this is the way it is. And God forbid, if one of you gets ill, you should seriously consider getting married if you're above the limits. But this client is below purposefully. So the idea of setting up one of these trusts in my mind seems like a little bit too much. Now, that being said, I would say to them, they should do 529s. I would talk to them about perhaps doing a donor advised fund and starting that and working almost like that's a foundation for them. And then with respect to their revocable living trusts, I make sure that when the kids get the money, they stay in continuing generation skipping tax trust for them. And we do all those protections because our revocable trust for our husband, for mom and dad, end up being an estate planning tool for the kids down the road. So I don't see this. The only thing I would also encourage them is to think about life insurance. I am an estate planner that loves life insurance for the right client. And I think that an irrevocable life insurance trust, it's boring, but darned if it doesn't work. And it's pretty powerful. And when that money comes pouring in, oh my God, it is a game changer. So if they don't want to do the ILIT, I say that's fine. Then you should think about getting life insurance on yourselves. At a minimum, get some term. It's so cheap. And then I said permanent's more of a commitment, but you should talk to your planner and see if you can afford it. And they seem to have some good assets here. And to me, that's just like a guaranteed liquid tax-free inheritance. So why not? So I don't think ILITs get the respect they deserve.
Well, they're going to get a slide soon, so we'll give them some respect in a moment. So I agree. The average family probably is not really in a position to do a lot of gifting. And actually, you could really be doing them harm because they're under the exemption amount. You transfer something, you give up the basis step up for essentially no estate tax benefits. So, other than maybe 529 plans, they're not really a good candidate for gifts or loans or either to a trust or otherwise. But the awesome family, which is the next slide, they're in a little better position. And I think both in terms of wealth, but also in terms of timing, they're a little further down the road, right? They're in their 60s. And so they have a little better sense of what they might need. And their time horizon's a little bit different than say the average family. And additionally, their kids are a little bit older, right? So, they maybe have a little better sense of how they might be coming out and might be a little bit more comfortable transitioning wealth. So, in a big picture, they're in a better position to gift. And they're also, either under the current exemption or the reduced exemption, they're going to be paying estate tax. And so it's a much more live question for them. I would say, when I look at their assets, I'm looking primarily at, their stock in the biotech company and then maybe the LLCs, the rental real estate. And if I could gift or sell the rental real estate so that I could fractionalize that, maybe to a grantor trust, a little bit of both, that would be maybe powerful for them. For the stock, I might be trying to convince the clients that maybe they should have their kids or descendants come along for the ride if this stock pops and goes up in value. Most times that's going to be to a grantor trust, but here, I think you got to ask some additional questions about, what type of entity is this? Is it a C Corp? Have they held it for the time period? Do they know if it's qualified small business stock? Because if it is, you have to be really careful. You don't want to mess up that qualified small business stock status, because that's, most of the planning we do is going to benefit the kids and the grandkids of the parents. But qualified small business stock, you have the ability to potentially offset some capital gains now while they're alive and reduce their capital gains tax bill. And that's a huge, huge win. And so for those of you not aware, you want to make sure that if you have qualified small business stock, you want to make sure it's transferred by gift and not by sale, because that alone can blow your status. And then oftentimes what we want to do is we want to use non-grantor trust for that stock, so that we can not only have the client get their $10 million capital gains exclusion, but a trust for each child can get it. So we can get, for the awesomes, we might be able to get $30 million of gain exclusion instead of just 10. And that's really powerful. If it's not QSBS stock, then I'm probably toggling back to a grantor trust so that the client can potentially pay the tax liability when the stock is sold and have that be an additional wealth transfer. So those are the ones that jump out at me. We'll talk about some other techniques for the awesome family in a minute, but when we're talking about gifts and sales and loans, that's kind of what it looks like to me. Those would be the ones I'd be focused in on.
Yeah, and then should you gift now? Should you wait until we get closer to the cliff? What I would then counsel them to do is at least set the trust up and seed them with something, so we're not scrambling in 2025 to set the trusts up. And then you can set those trusts up to receive the assets from the revocable trust, so you're not wasting your time on that one. And then also, if they want a little more control, you can think about doing a Delaware trust or a South Dakota trust, or a directed trust, which have a little more flexibility than we have in California, and how to get jurisdiction on those. And then you want to talk a little bit about, instead of using the 20 million,
Yeah. So they probably have a magnitude question too, which is, when they've got 45 million, they may or may not want to give away, $24 million. Clients come in, I got to use 24 million. Well, look, it would be great if we all had $24 million to give away and it made sense. But that doesn't mean that if for this particular client, 10 or 12 million wouldn't be really powerful. If they were thinking of that, and that's, close to a quarter of their wealth, we might try to talk to them about trying to use one spouse's exemption instead of both, right? Because if I use one $12 million exemption and none of the other client, then when the exemption drops down to $5 or $6 million, we've now got 12 million plus 6, so 18. So yeah, we didn't capture 24 million, but 18 is still a whole lot better than 12. And so we're looking at that. There are some complexities with that type of planning. You've got to have separate property, and so they may need to transmute something, which may mean separate counsel, but that might be really powerful for them if they're in that magnitude. And for clients in this space, 30, 40, 50 million, that is oftentimes the planning that we're doing, is just try to use one exemption or put them on the path so that they can use one exemption as we get close to 2025. And I'm a big proponent of take some initial steps, fund some assets in the grantor trust, see how it works, you'll get a sense of it, and then we can continue to add assets to that. And as it gains wealth, it will have liquidity potentially to be able to buy assets. And so it becomes a tool for future wealth planning as well.
Yeah. And again, if they keep the grantor trust rules, you can always use sales down the road. And if you see them and they have integrity, that'll be something that we can use, let alone the gifting. Next slide, Brandon. So this one I think is a no-brainer. I just go, you got to set up a grantor trust. You should have used your credit probably January 1, 2018 to get it out. I think you should go out of California and do a South Dakota or Wyoming, or just get the directed trust to keep it more flexible. The hope is to really, put in growth assets in there and make this thing just explode in value. And having the directed trust and the ability to do direction committees and investment committee really provide a lot of flexibility. So these clients, and I did have one in 2019 that he was about 400 million and he hadn't used it. And I was just like, well, what are you waiting for? So, and most of these clients that have, the blended family is a different issue, but if they have a non-blended family and they have children, my question to them is, how much do you want them to get? And most people, the range now is like between 30 to $50 million net they want each child to get. And I was like, I think they're going to be okay with that amount of money. So what we've done is we set up these trusts, and we put money in them, and then we're watching them grow. And then the estate plan at the second death, we actually fill up the tank to $21 or whatever it is. And then if those trusts hit past that mark, then it all just goes to a foundation, and then no tax, and it's great. So we have at least about 5 to 10 matters like that where we've set up those trusts, and in one of them they're close to hitting their mark, believe it or not. And now the widow is rethinking how much she wants to give those kids in those trusts. But then you get into these issues that the kids have too much and you're sucking out. And I did see on one of the AgTech things about silent trusts and providing protections and really protecting the child from themselves. And that's why I like the directed trusts. And some of the stuff in Delaware that I've read, it's incredible that you can keep them in the dark and really protect these kids. Because I can tell you, if I was 18 years old and I knew I had a $50 million trust, I don't think I'd be sitting here today. I'd probably be somewhere on a beach, somewhere with the Kardashians or whoever it is. So that's just an honest answer. And I think a lot of people that way. People say, oh, I win the lottery, I'm going to go back to work. I'm like, no, you're not. I'm not going back to work. I told everybody I'd come in, I'd set up a foundation and they can all work for me. But no, I'm going to France, I think, and partying. So the protections of those other trusts and directed trusts are really important, I think.
Yeah, and I think for the mates too, once you've used up your exemption, things like loans and sales are really important. You could just shift wealth or the use of that wealth for a period of time. And so you can really double down on that once you've got those funded. So for them, I think the grantor trust initially funded and then shifting a lot of wealth through loaning money to those trusts to take advantage of that capital is really powerful for that. Our next slide is on insurance trusts, and maybe what we'll do is just go back to the averages, and we can just kind of walk through our clients and talk a little bit about that. Phil, you just want to talk a little bit about insurance
So
trusts?
again, I think this is a no-brainer for them. I think having no life insurance is a mistake, as long as they can get it and it's affordable. I think it would be a great component to their estate plan. Again, since they're below the estate mark, they could just own it, and then it'll just be taxable in their state. There's no tax at first death, and there's liquidity for the spouse. But if they wanted to do life insurance, because things change a lot, I don't think that's a bad idea either. So to me, I would at least mention it to him. I actually had a guy who I pitched this a long time ago, and he said at the end, I went, oh, you should consider a life insurance trust. And he said, my financial advisor said, if you didn't mention life insurance trust, I shouldn't hire you. I was like, oh yeah, it's probably a good financial advisor. So I just find that life insurance is such an important tool, and when it's liquid, it's just a godsend, and tax-free, it's a godsend. And there's not a lot of upkeep on the ILETs. That being said, people buy these insurance policies, 20 years ago, and they're just sitting there. They are an asset. You got to look at them, and you got to work with the insurance people to make sure it's a good product, because they, just like anything, they could not be a good product.
And so how about the Awesome family? I'm guessing the answer is going to be an ILET for them. Probably makes some sense. You can go forward one slide. Perfect. So they've got their second to die policy, $1 million. They're in a taxable estate. So, do you see the same thing for them in terms of?
Well, I mean, the second to die policy, we should get rid of that. They don't need it. And I would take that policy and I would transfer it to an ILET. If you transfer an existing policy, you may remember that there's a 3-year pullback. So you got a 3-year rule. There's workarounds around that as well. You can figure out some way to try to do it. I think that one's a no-brainer to get that in there, and then to see if you can get a little more insurance to cover the spread so that they have some liquidity. So I would say that's a no-brainer on that one.
And then if you go forward one more for the mates, they've got a $20 million second to die policy. I'm guessing the answer is going to be similar. The question for them is really going to be how much estate tax they're actually going to want to pay. And if they cap out what they're leaving to their kids, they may or may not have estate tax if they're going to leave things to charity. Sometimes you see that, but assuming they're not, and they're going to have estate tax, similar ILET.
Yeah, I mean, at least it's a consideration, and they can decide. Again, it'll be important to see if they're backing into a number that they want to give to the kids, and if it's a no tax estate. But I just think, especially when you have life insurance, so with younger clients, when they come in, I'm like, you got to get life insurance. It's just, at least talk to an agent. And my thing on life insurance is, don't hire somebody hire an agent that has no skin in the game, not your cousin from Omaha, and then price it out at $1 million increments, and then you see how much you can afford, and then you can start small and get bigger as your estate progresses.
Great. So if you could just go back to the averages again, and then another technique we oftentimes use are transfer. So the Cupers and Grats are common ones that come in this category. The grantor is going to retain the right to use or some benefit from it for a period of time. And then at the end of a time period, what's left is going to go to the next generation. And by doing that, you've sort of deferred the time period in which the recipient's getting that. So you get a little bit of a time value of money discount. And then oftentimes you can use fractionalized interest to put in there. Cupert is going to be a residence. So that's what you're putting in there. For a grad, it's going to be other assets. In looking at the clients, again, for the averages, really, they're not going to be an appropriate candidate for this type of planning. They just really shouldn't be doing big gifting at this point, and they're too early in their arc. If you go to the next slide, for the awesomes, I think the Mammoth condo might be one where I would say that might be something you might consider as a Cupert asset. You can do the math and also do it for the primary residence, and frankly, I've shown lots of clients how they could save taxes, but there's a challenge with that. And it's the idea that at some point they're not going to own their home and they have to rent it from their kids. And so even though mathematically it might work out really well, in my experience, Cuperts are one of those things where unless it's a second residence, it tends not to be something the clients are comfortable. Have had a few clients who are comfortable with it and it has been really effective, but it takes the right client with the right mindset to be able to do it with their personal residence. I think the Mammoth is much more likely. Yeah. And then for the Grat, I would say, maybe there's some benefit to putting some of the stock in the biotech and the Grat for these folks, but the other planning with the grantor trust is probably going to be enough for them, and you may not need to get to Grats and Cuperts for the awesome family.
Yeah, and the next slide. All these things are viable for this client. It's just a question of how much complexity they want and how many trusts do they want. You get to the point where you're like, now I got a Cupert and I got a Grad. And so if they have good people backing them up and the people that can kind of manage the compliance and such, everything's on the table, but you really got to make sure they understand what they're getting into, because it can be pretty complex. So I think the Grats are a great idea for this client. You can think about doing a Cupert. I am very protective of their home. Other than that, with second residence, I think they're good deals as well.
Yeah, and for the Bates, Cupert seems like it might work for some of the other properties. Although I will say there seems to be like an asterisk next to each one of these properties, right? So New York City co-ops are just a nightmare to deal with. I had a client, it took us a year and a half to transfer ownership of their co-op from their name to their revocable trust. I don't know what would have happened if it was not a revocable trust, but it cost them tens of thousands of dollars because they had to pay the co-op's legal fees as well. And it was honestly, it was a nightmare. And had we known, we probably would never I would have just said, look, you just deal with a New York probate. It's going to be easier than dealing with the New York co-op. And then in France, the French laws, they're not really that excited about trust. So, Paris property may not be a good choice. And for the Texas ranch, it may or may not qualify as a residence, depending on what type of ranch it is. But even if it does, my experience with ranches is oftentimes there's a whole lot of operating costs with it. So you're going to put this in a Cupert and then you're going to have to deal with how you pay for it. It's oftentimes a real challenge. So even though it looks like a Cupert might work well for these clients, you got to look at the individual assets. These ones may or may not be a good fit. And then if you wouldn't mind moving forward to kind of the
second to last slide,
third to last slide, I think it is. It should say slats.
Yeah, let's finish up with slats. So tell me about slats.
We're going to finish up with slats, which I think is everyone's favorite planning technique, or at least everyone who's not an estate planning attorney in California is their favorite planning technique is a slat. Slats actually do provide some great benefits. The whole idea is sort of have your cake and eat it too. And so the idea is you can transfer your wealth, use up your exemption, even apply GST exemption, and potentially have assets that are available for your spouse. And then the idea is, wink, wink, hopefully your spouse is nice to you and they'll take care of you as well. And so that's the whole idea, which is I can transfer it, but still have sort of a back door to access the assets. And, for the right client, that can be a really good tool. And for a client who's not able to use up their exemption in another way, and that's the only way they're comfortable, I think it'd be a good tool. But But there's some real problems with slats.
Yeah, I think they're real problematic. I have a tough time getting my head around them. I like the idea of using like hedging, using one person's credit instead of playing this game. I think you need separate counsel. I think that the situations can get really problematic. And I have one now where there was a divorce and I think they were married 40 years, 45 years, and they're now getting divorced. And they did a one-way slat. But I just think there are a lot of pitfalls in it. I've gotten to a point in my career where I don't need to really stick my head in and play traffic in those. And I usually go, I used to say, call Jeremy. Now he's with me. So now I say, call Rebecca or call Brian Sue or something. So I'm not a big fan of them. And I try to talk people out of them. I think they're complex and they're fraught with a lot of problems. And you have problems with reciprocal trusts if they are identical and the IRS could collapse them anyway. I would rather do a more non-complex plan and be a hell of a lot cheaper for them to take advantage of the credit. So that's my position on Pilates.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that you tell the client, look, you can set up the slap, but if your spouse dies or you get divorced, there's no more safety net for you. So then their immediate reaction is, well, okay, then my spouse should set up one for me too, right? And then we're fine. That puts you right in the reciprocal trust doctrine. So you have the risk that by doing that, the gifts don't even work. And then you've got this concept of, even if it's not reciprocal trust, well, maybe there's an implied agreement to set up the trust between each other. And you've got the small Dino case that kind of follows along this logic. It's not a slat case, but the idea is, look, if I do something for you, I transfer assets and then you're going to put them for my benefit. We might look through that and ignore the whole thing. And then, yeah, as a lawyer, I don't know how you're able to advise clients who come to you and say, okay, we want to do slats. Okay, well, in your slat, do you want to provide that if you guys get divorced, your spouse is still the beneficiary, or do you want to provide for the spouse to be named later to jump in, kind of the new spouse? Obviously, if you're representing both of them, one spouse has an answer that's right for them. The other spouse has the exact opposite answer. It makes it really difficult to be able to do that planning. And so to me, that means you've got to go out and get separate family lawyers, transmute property to separate property so you can do this. And you may even need separate estate planning lawyers to be able to do this planning. And I think, before the clients were looking at Phil saying, we got to hire you and 2 more lawyers. Well, I got to hire you and 3 more lawyers. I'm not that excited about it. There are estate planning lawyers who will do this planning without requiring all that. I'm aware of that. But I think because of California law, the validity of the transmutation is based on, one factor is based on whether you got separate counsel. I just think you really can't do that planning without it to be effective. And again, I don't know that puts me in the minority, but I think there are other lawyers who think differently. So to be fair, but I just think it's just, for most clients, the complexity of that relative to their other choices, it makes it not worth it.
Yeah, I say buy a life insurance trust and get a life insurance policy, and it's a lot simpler and easier, and you cross buy on each other, and everybody's happy.
So if you go to the next slide, we can talk about some alternatives. But I always tell my clients, look, if you have a grantor trust, one of the safety nets you have is potentially to be able to swap assets back. So if that asset, you pick the wrong asset to put in there and you want one back and you want it to generate income for you, you can put other assets in there that aren't generating income and get that back. Or you can potentially even borrow against that. So if you need to do that, and borrowing is better than you taking a distribution out of a slat, because that makes the slat an inefficient use of your exemption. Whereas if you borrow, at least you preserve the estate planning bits of it. And then you can also, as Phil said, do an ILET, or you could just gift less. What I always tell my clients is, look, the gifting doesn't need to be perfect, and we don't need to accomplish everything all at once. Taking small steps that are considered over long periods of time is actually really effective. And if you try to do everything all at once, you're taking away some of the agency of your future self, right? Is your future self going to look back and say, wow, I wish I wouldn't have given away that much all at once? You just need to improve the situation over no planning. And actually, that's harder than it sounds, given the tax differentials. When you gift, you can actually do a lot of harm. So you really have to be careful. And so again, I'm always looking for, those enhancements, those opportunities where I can gift, where I'm going to use exemption that might expire, or I'm going to fractionalize, or grantor trust where I can pay income tax, something more than just the gift. And then flexibility over time. And I find that's much more powerful than, I've got a bunch of these clients who in 2012, it's because one client set up, 2 slats and an LLC, and they put 100% of their assets in both these structures. And And yeah, it looks great on paper, but you know, every time they want to buy a house, they come to me and they say, well, how do I buy a house? And I say, well, you know, you got to borrow from the LLC or take a distribution that's proportionate. And then the ownership has to be, you know, 1/3 this trust, 42% that trust, 22% this trust. And, you know, I didn't set up the plan, but they're living with it, and it's not effective for them. Honestly, they'd have been better off doing a little bit less and not having those tags to it.
Yeah, so one size doesn't fit all. And again, like in the beginning, I said, yeah, just the changes in the economy, the changes in the world, the changes in people living longer, and then they just keep changing the tax laws. So you just have to really look at it. I think we're probably past our time, Bill. Sorry. So if you got questions, you can ask us afterwards or send us emails. I guess you got time? Yeah, if you guys have any questions, fire away. No. I planted her.
Everybody looks like they're still awake, so at least we passed that test, I think, barely.
How's the Secure Act affecting the planning that we're doing for high net worth people? Yeah, I think it's complicated things. And I always like IRAs for charitable planning. I think it's a win-win. I remember a long time ago, I was trying to figure out how to get the credit to protect the IRA. And I went to a estate planning seminar, and the presenter said, you just give it to charity. And I went, oh, it's like, 80% of their estate. And he goes, I don't have clients like that, son. And I went, oh. Wasn't that nice? So yeah, I mean, we have new language in our trust to deal with the rules, and then depending upon who the client is, if it's like that $6 million one for the, I'm like, yeah, just work that with a charity, and it's a lot simpler. I always tell clients retirement plans are supposed to be for retirement. They're not inheritance plans, and there are people in my deceased parents' generation that just save, and they pass along. My folks died. My mom died in 2017, so I am stringing mine out. And I actually had a client yesterday who went sibling to sibling, and we're going to get some benefits there. And the CPA was mentioning it, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right. There's one of the exceptions. But yeah, it's just another thing. And Secure was so big, and then COVID came and boop, knocked it off the stage. So I think we're getting more and more information on that, but I like IRAs for charity.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I can convince the client to give the IRA to charity, that's always the best outcome, because the stretch out rules are just harder to comply with. Phil says we've kind of gone down that, and some of the recent regs have made certain parts easier and other parts harder. But yeah, if charity works for the client and they want it, that's the first dollars I always tell them to give to charity. I don't know if that's exactly what you're getting at, but that's definitely the conversations that I have with my clients.
Yeah, and I think Jeremy said at the beginning that we didn't really get into the charitable planning with this. This was more for transferring, but that is a huge component of, especially for that third case study. Yeah, you're going to pay tax unless you involve a charity. So that's a wrap. Thank you very much for everybody's attention. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you all so much, Phil, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. I think we have a lot to think about. We still need to be pushing today towards the cliff in the future. I knew we'd have the most thoughtful of presentations, that illustrate all the different things that they think about as we look at the different types of clients, the 3 tiers that we just experienced. But thank you very much. If you have questions, certainly let me know and I can pass them on and round them out around to all of our members. Just a reminder, September 6th, we have Pekin Grayson of Whittier Trust, who's going to be talking about philanthropic conversations with your clients. So kind of nice dovetail with Phil's last point. And thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.